go through today are some quick tips. And so I'm going to start with some of the science of consequences. So what are consequences? What are some of these words that we often hear, like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, and also how we can choose the most appropriate consequences as well. Then I'm going to go into praise, preference assessments, giving choices, first then follow through and data collection. So let's jump into consequences. And so what are consequences? These get confused very often. So we know, a lot of us know about positive reinforcement and punishment. So, and we usually connect that to good or bad. But that's not necessarily always true. The biggest thing with consequences is that it is something that follows your behavior that will either increase or decrease the likelihood of it occurring again in the future. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, if the stove is on, you might get burnt and you're probably not going to do that again. But again, if the stove is off, that's just neutral. That's a neutral consequence, and that doesn't really, what you do in the future will, show what type of consequence that was. And when I say type of consequence, there's positive and negative consequences. And again, when we hear these, typically we think of good and bad, but it's not just good and bad. When we're talking about positive and negative, we're actually talking about adding stimuli to the environment or taking stimuli away. So when we think about positive reinforcement, that means that we are adding something that will then increase behavior in the future. If we're talking about negative reinforcement, we're actually talking about taking something away that, again, will increase behavior in the future. So a really good example of negative reinforcement is escaping. So, escaping chores, escaping homework. Those are all types of negative reinforcement that may increase the likelihood that they're going to engage in those behaviors again in the future so that they can escape doing chores or homework. And then punishment. Punishment gets a bad rap. And there are very bad and severe forms of punishment, but not all punishment is severe. And when I'd like to make sure that when I'm teaching my students that we talk about punishment as it's simply you're just decreasing future behavior. And I like to always remind people, if the behavior didn't decrease, it wasn't punished. And if the behavior didn't increase, it wasn't reinforced. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about once we get into that preference assessment area as well. And then when we talk about these types of consequences, this is one of the biggest things that I see when I go into homes or almost anything. I know my parents we're also guilty of this, but the consequences should match the behavior. So they should be similar or connected to the behavior. One thing that, my parents were guilty of were making empty threats, or were saying, you're grounded for a month. That was never an effective consequence because it was never, it never followed through on, and it also wasn't necessarily connected to the behavior. So, for example, if we have a child who, dumps food on the ground or, purposely knocks their drink over, as a consequence that is connected to that is going to be them cleaning it up and, restoring that situation back to good. So, them cleaning up their mess, that is a directly related consequence to the behavior. And that can be taken for good or for bad. It can be taken for, if if they complete their homework, you know, we don't say, oh, great, let's go to Disneyland, because that's just not connected. That's, you know, that's just for completing homework. We don't necessarily give one of the biggest consequences that we can. We keep it very similar to that level of where homework is at.